Week 25 Overview Camelot and Crisis. This week focuses in on President Kennedy's last 2 years. These were dramatic years in America and around the world. 1962 and 1963 contain some of the most vivid moments in recent history. People who lived through these years can't forget the Cuban Missile Crisis, the burning Buddhist priests of Vietnam, the civil rights violence, Martin Luther King's speech at the March on Washington, or JFK's assassination and funeral. Dialectic learners continue to study Africa this week, while every learning level looks at civil rights in America. The Cold War was in full swing, breaking out in different ways all over the planet, from Cuba to Vietnam to the new nations of post-colonial Africa. John F. Kennedy had his hands full. The whole world seemed to be in flux. But that's what happens when nuclear superpowers square off against each other. Neither Russia nor the United States was willing to push the big red button that would end civilization as we know it, so they fought out the Cold War by proxy, in guerrilla wars and insurrections around the world. The least unpleasant part of the Cold War was probably the space race, which was in full swing in 1961, when the Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit. America was determined to catch up. A month after Gagarin's famous flight, JFK announced the American goal of putting a man on the moon within a decade. On February 20th, 1962, America took its first big step in that direction. Astronaut John Glenn orbited the Earth. While John Glenn was circling the planet, a black man named James Meredith changed America just by going to college. Meredith had been so inspired by JFK's inauguration speech that he applied to attend the all-white campus of the University of Mississippi, known to football fans as Ole Miss, the next day. That was a brave move because, although the courts had officially ended segregation, Mississippi hadn't. They wouldn't let James Meredith attend the university. On September 30th, 1962, the federal government helped Meredith sneak onto campus, where he hunkered down in a dorm room. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had ordered 400 non-military U.S. Marshals to campus to keep him safe. A mob gathered and started throwing lit cigarettes, gravel, lead pipes, bricks, even bottles filled with gasoline at the marshals. Chaos erupted, and a reporter and a repairman were shot dead. JFK called out the Army to support his marshals, but Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett told the state police to block the highways. By the time the Army finally arrived, over 100 marshals had been wounded, yet none had fired on the mob. The next day, accompanied by a bullet-marked government car, James Meredith finally registered for his classes. It took thousands of soldiers, 100 injuries, and 2 deaths, but one black man finally had a chance for a better education. About 2 weeks later, JFK's next crisis began. On October 1962, the U.S. learned that the Soviet Union was building a missile launching site in Cuba. That would put Soviet nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida, within range of every capital in North and South America, and, given rocket speeds, within just minutes of Washington, D.C. The situation demanded immediate action, so Kennedy quarantined all Soviet ships heading for Cuba with missile materials aboard. Khrushchev ordered his ships to defy the Navy boats that enforced the quarantine. Kennedy's military advisors wanted him to use military action, but Kennedy exercised caution and diplomacy, even as he publicly announced his readiness to engage in nuclear war if he had to. The world had held its breath for 4 tense days. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev were willing to back down. It was the most dangerous direct confrontation between nuclear-armed superpowers in history. In the end, after super-secret negotiations, Khrushchev called back his ships and promised to remove the launch sites from Cuba. The United States publicly agreed not to invade Cuba and secretly promised to remove its aging nuclear missiles from Turkey. Cuba was just one of many developing countries that were taking sides during the Cold War. New nations of post-colonial Africa were declaring their independence by the droves, 14 new nations in 1960, 3 more in 1961, 4 in 1962. Many African leaders wanted some form of socialism for their new nation. Traditional African culture had always been sort of socialist. Tribal societies had been classless and communal, with little concept of private ownership. Traditional African societies tended to make decisions by consensus. After discussions, the majority opinion and decisions of the community as a whole were respected by all. Africa had never adopted the individualism and capitalist economy that had helped Europe to advance. No wonder, then, that many of the new African leaders tried to nationalize their agriculture and industry. Many also led their countries to become one-party states, suppressing political opposition. Not all of the newly independent African nations were ruled by blacks. In South Africa, white nationalists had gained power in 1948 and succeeded in imposing a racial rule called apartheid, a Dutch word meaning apartness or separation. It was like the racial segregation of the American South. Apartheid separated black and white people in every aspect of life, including work, home, public service, politics, and education. Nelson Mandela, a black South African, was at first a leader like Martin Luther King Jr., who believed in breaking down apartheid by nonviolent means. What had worked for Gandhi in India didn't work so well in South Africa, however. After peacefully opposing racism for years, Mandela gave up the nonviolent approach and began to support armed struggle. Back in the States, Martin Luther King Jr. still believed in nonviolence, but he also knew that Dixie wouldn't change its racist ways without a major confrontation. That's why he agreed to participate in a major showdown in Birmingham, Alabama. King knew that Birmingham was the segregation center of the South, defiant of change and proud of it. Going there to hold a peaceful demonstration was like waving a red flag in front of a mad bull. Hundreds of black activists began peaceful demonstrations in Birmingham, one of the most segregated cities in America. At first, things were a little too peaceful. The police were polite, and the journalists got bored. So, on Good Friday, 1963, King escalated the controversy by violating a court order prohibiting further demonstrations. He was arrested and put in jail, which made headlines at the New York Times. It was there that King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which would later be considered the civil rights movement's most significant statement of purpose and one of the best explanations of American democracy. On May 2nd, D-Day as some called it, black children upped the ante in Birmingham. Hundreds skipped school to join the protest, and 600 were jailed. Twice as many skipped school the next day. The police used fire hoses and German shepherd dogs to break up the crowd of kids. The evening news showed it all, and newspapers around the globe carried pictures of a police dog attacking a 15-year-old boy. People across America continued to see segregation revealed. As a result, President Kennedy mobilized his administration to bring a complete end of segregation to the nation. It was in this context that Martin Luther King led his March on Washington. In August 1963, 250,000 people gathered on the Washington, D.C. Mall. Television cameras carried King's I Have a Dream speech. This demonstration was the peaceful triumph of King's nonviolent assault on American racism. Yet even as Martin Luther King spoke of his dream of an America without discrimination, America was supporting other governments that committed even greater evils. It was all part of the Cold War, which made for some ugly compromises. Kennedy supported North Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was fighting the communists in North Vietnam. The problem was that Diem was thoroughly corrupt. He put his friends and family in high positions, poured money into the cities while letting the rural families sink deeper into poverty, and persecuted the Buddhist population ruthlessly. Several Buddhist monks set themselves on fire to show their protest, and the media caught those images on film. Kennedy finally authorized a secret CIA plan to overthrow President Diem in late October 1963. The coup took place a few days later, on November 2, 1963. Diem and his brother were arrested and were promised safe exile, but they were then executed by military officers. To this day, nobody knows for sure whether the assassination was part of Kennedy's plan or not. 20 days later, in Texas, JFK himself was assassinated as he rode through Dallas in an open car in a presidential motorcade. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 and then came back in 1962, shot and killed the president. Or so they say. JFK's death has generated a huge number of conspiracy theories. A brief review of Lee Harvey Oswald's activities make it look like an open and shut case of a communist killing the anti-communist leader of the free world, but a lot of Americans don't want to believe that. Well into the next century now, people are still debating what really happened that day in Dallas.